Welcome, everyone. I wanted to bring to the stage David Gustin. He's the Associate Vice Provost for Discovery, Engagement, and Outcomes at the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Lab at Arizona State University. Take it away, Dave.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to your GFL events team for helping bring us the second of a GFL engagement space activity, where today we'll be hearing from Athena Aktipis and Andrew Maynard about podcasting as techniques for engagement with a variety of audiences. It is a great pleasure to be able to introduce Athena and Andrew to you today. Both have been colleagues and friends of mine for a while, since they've been at ASU. Athena actually lives across the street from me, and in fact, I'm looking out of my living room window at her house. Athena, everything looks okay over there. It's just fine. Slightly more formally, Athena is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology here at ASU. She's a Lincoln professor attached to the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics. Among a variety of roles, she directs the Interdisciplinary Cooperation Initiative, because she is a student of cooperation across a variety of systems, from human sharing to cancer. She produces the live stream Channel Zed, chairs the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting, hosts the science podcast Zombified, which we'll hear about today, and she has authored the recent book, The Cheating Cell: How Evolution Helps Us Understand and Treat Cancer. My colleague in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society in the College of Global Futures, Andrew Maynard, is a professor and associate dean for curriculum and student success in College of Global Futures. Andrew is a scientist, author, and internationally recognized expert and thought leader in emerging technologies and their responsible and ethical development use. Andrew hosts the new podcast, Mission Interplanetary, for Slate. He also did a podcast previously in the context of SFIS with Heather Ross. I think the name of that was Future Out Loud. Correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew. And he is the author of Future Rising: A Journey from the Past to the Edge of Tomorrow, which explores our collective relationship with the future and our responsibility to it. So we will have brief opportunity to listen to Athena and Andrew describe and talk about their journey to podcast hosts. We'll interact with them a little bit, have time for questions and answers, and wrap up just short of the top of the next hour with a couple of announcements back from Lauren. So Athena, I'd like to invite you to join us and tell us a little bit about Zombified.
Hey, David, good to see you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about my podcast and just in general, kind of how we can take these sort of new media approaches to communicating with broad audiences about science. So for me, it all really started with the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting. So I organized the first meeting in 2018, and really the whole point of that meeting was to take a lot of the science that was going on around evolutionary medicine, around sort of policy and sort of, issues of like, how do we solve bigger collective issues that could be apocalyptic for human futures, and could we kind of bring all of these kinds of questions into an interdisciplinary space that would allow for really unique conversations and also just make it fun, because I think there's a lot of really fascinating issues, both in sort of the hard sciences, in sort of the social sciences of how do we as humans work together to deal with problems, and lots of important impacts also from humanities and the arts, and there just wasn't a space for that. So we put together this meeting to be a space for that, and the idea of it was essentially, we can look at a lot of what's going on in the world through this lens of zombification, whether it's how parasites take over our brains, how a pandemic changes our society, or, really a more sort of apocalyptic, like, well, there's a lot of things in the future that aren't going to be good, but how do we like take a slightly more playful approach to make it more fun to engage? Because I think a lot of times, when we think about the difficulties that we as humans are likely to face in the future, it's easy to kind of be like, oh, I just don't want to pay attention to that. Like, look the other way, because we don't know what to do. And it's hard to engage with things that are scary when we don't know what to do about them. So yeah, so for me, it all started with the zombie apocalypse medicine meeting. And then this sort of frame of sort of looking at the world through this idea of zombification really, it caught on for me. And it was also around that time, like, late 2018, when I started really listening to podcasts myself. And I found myself looking for a podcast that was about the things I was interested in, all the stuff that is manipulating our brains, whether it's microbes or other humans or information on the internet. And so I was actually complaining that this podcast didn't exist to my graduate student. And she said, well, you should start it. You should make a podcast. And I thought that was just about the most ridiculous thing I ever heard, because like, how would I have time for a podcast, with all the other things I have going on? It just seemed like not possible. But that idea kind of planted in my head and zombified me, I guess you could say. And at some point I was like, oh, if I did do a podcast, I could call it Zombified. And then from that point forward, it was kind of over. It was like, yeah, I'm gonna have to do this. And so I'll share screen with you and show you the website for the podcast. We have some pretty nice visuals. So one of the things I love about working on this podcast is that we have a phenomenal illustrator, Neil Smith. He's done all the art for the podcast. And every episode, we actually work together to produce a cover that really kind of captures the main idea from the podcast. So it's a very sort of multi-dimensional way of communicating, because we've got, the actual hour to hour and a half long, so long form conversations, where really the idea is that, it's not so much an interview as it really is like a back and forth conversation. And when we try to kind of create this environment for listeners where it's almost like you're just listening in on people talking about interesting stuff. And for me, that's really important, because one of the things I love about being a professor is that I get to have interesting conversations with people all the time. And I can just like email somebody who's interesting and be like, can we have a conversation? And that can happen. And the podcast is kind of like an extension of that, except now it's like a recorded conversation that a lot of people can listen to. And no matter, what the sort of subtopic is, the frame is always, well, how are we zombified by this thing? What are the mechanisms that get us zombified? What are the consequences of us being zombified? Is it all bad? Is it partially good? And kind of what does this mean for, the future of humanity? And I always ask guests what their version is of the zombie apocalypse. Like if they're, like for example, the episode with Amy Body about microchimeras, like this is about how there's fetal cells in brains of moms. So it's like, well, what's the zombie apocalypse of, moms being totally, their brains being taken over by their babies? So you have lots of fun ways that you can actually take the science and then sort of use that to like animate these sort of, more like storytelling kind of approach with like, well, what's the version of the zombie apocalypse that comes out of this kind of zombification? So, so that's kind of the big picture of the podcast. It's kind of evolved now to not just be a podcast that is long form audio, but we also have sort of shorter form and also some long form video that David was mentioning, Channel Zed. So with Channel Zed, what we have are actually like a set of shows that are on different topics, and so I produce them all, but we have different hosts for different shows. So we have like a show where we look at clips from movies. We have a show that's about basically evolutionary medicine in the apocalypse. We do Q&As, and all of this stuff is actually available on our YouTube site. And the nice thing about this is that it's kind of taking things to another level in terms of audience interaction. So people can actually post questions through YouTube, through Twitter, through Facebook. So these live streams are going to all those platforms. People can ask questions, and then as a sort of behind the scenes producer, me or whoever is doing the sort of video production for that show can bring those questions in, choose which questions to bring in, and then bring those to the people who are hosting the show or being interviewed. So it creates a sort of real time and highly interactive podcast-like environment, but with video and sort of a greater richness. So it's a little bit different from the podcast that maybe you listen to on a long car ride or while you're doing the dishes or going for a walk. This is more something that you like sit down with your computer or on your smartphone and interact while the show is going on. So that's kind of the big picture on my science engagement with the public projects. I think those are the two main things. I also love to write for general audiences and do events like this. So yeah, it's definitely become a big focus for me. And I teach a graduate level course that's kind of cross-listed in most of the sciences. That's a communication for scientists course. So any graduate students that want to do podcasting, writing for general audiences, or making YouTube videos, whatever they're interested in, it's a course that can kind of help them to learn about the opportunities and options. So yeah, so David, that's my spiel. Happy to chat more about it or pass it along to Andrew, and then he and I can talk after he's given his presentation.
Great, thanks, Athena. And it really has become an important theme in your work. And I think with respect to the writing, you've got a piece in Stephen Beschloss's sort of online journal Transformations as well, which is incredibly powerful. So you're developing an amazing body of work in this area. I do want to give Andrew a chance to step in. So Andrew, you've got your new podcast, but you've also got a depth of experience in the area.
Yes, although what I really want to do is talk about zombies with Athena. So hopefully we'll get to that really quickly. And plus I want to know how on earth you find all the time to do this. So this to me is probably the biggest question we have here. How on earth, in really busy professional lives, do we find time to engage with people outside academia? But yes, I guess just 2 or 3 things to say here before we get into the conversation. As you mentioned, Dave, we recently launched the Mission Interplanetary podcast, and this is a collaboration between the Interplanetary Initiative at ASU and Slate magazine, and had a long history. We've been preparing for this for about a couple of years. And the original idea, and this sort of fits into a longer narrative around why on earth I do this, was the Interplanetary Initiative at ASU is not only an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary initiative that really focuses on the nature of humanity's future in space and space exploration, but it's also one of these initiatives that goes well beyond the bounds and the walls of academia. And we were really interested initially in how we expose people outside of ASU in particular to some of the thinking that's going on here and some of the people that are doing amazing work. And it sounds very similar to where you started, Athena, with thinking about your work here and the work that intersected with the ideas around zombies. Over the last couple of years, this has really sort of expanded into something where we realized we had a unique opportunity to begin to explore some really interesting questions around space exploration, and the sorts of questions that people typically aren't asking in any depth at the moment, with guests that typically aren't given the opportunity to explore these. So we're now just over halfway through this first season. It's a fairly short season of just 8 episodes, and I've no idea how you do these long form episodes, Athena. We only have 30-minute episodes that are really tightly produced. But out of those 8 episodes, we have 9 guests. If I'm remembering correctly, 7 of them are women, which is really important when we're talking about space exploration, because there's a tendency with space podcasts to focus on the gee whiz science here and the engineering, and just have a bunch of testosterone-driven guys talking about how wonderful it is. And we want to flip that equation. So not only have we got a really fascinating lineup of women here from all different perspectives. In fact, this week is Katie Mack, who is an absolutely fascinating theoretical astrophysicist. But we've had people like Natalie Trevino on talking about the decolonization of space, and decolonization of space exploration, which is incredibly topical and pertinent at the moment, especially when you look at the language that has driven space exploration over the last few decades. So with this, we set out to have these conversations around really interesting, really important aspects of space exploration in a way that is highly accessible to a broad audience. And that brings me back to my motivation here. So I'm a physicist. I'm not a space person, as I'm interested in space. I'm really interested in how you make the stuff we do as academics accessible to others, meaningful to others, and impactful within society. And that's what's drawn me to the podcast medium, as well as what we're doing with Mission Interplanetary, because I very much see us as having an obligation back to society to make sure that the things we do, the things we think about, the things we discover are actually useful to other people throughout society. And this is one really powerful way of doing this. It's not the only way. So over the last 20 plus years, I've worked in a lot of different media and in a lot of different directions to see how we can actually effectively make these translations. And it's not really about communication or even just engagement, but it's about how do you give people access to knowledge and information and insights that change their worlds, their insights, their perspectives in positive ways, and give them the tools and the abilities they need to be part of building the future they aspire to. And we can do this in a number of ways. Podcasts really fascinate me. And I must actually, as I wrap up, because I really want to talk to Athena, I must confess I don't actually listen to that many podcasts. But I do make them. And Dave, you mentioned the Future Out Loud podcast, which is where I cut my teeth with Heather Ross a few years ago from SFIS, which really was just a conversational podcast. But what I am interested in is, how do you make the stuff we know and do accessible to others so that they can actually use it in their lives to achieve the things that they want to? And with that, if it's okay, Dave, I would love to sort of bring Athena back, because I would love to get a sense from you as to how much this is a motivation to you in terms of translating what you know to others and helping others make sense and use of that.
That's a great place to start. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. It's such a pleasure to get the chance to chat with you. I'm really excited to talk. It's the work that you're doing sounds just awesome. And I completely agree that, so much of our responsibility as, people who have the privilege to spend our time thinking about, these big ideas and, testing scientific hypotheses, and just like, getting that opportunity is to communicate not just the things that we're learning, but also that, we don't have all the answers. There's a lot of open questions, and that inquiry is such an important part of being human. And that, when it comes to, some of the smartest people in the world, some of the people I've had on my podcast, they're just like so unbelievably smart. They don't have all the answers. We're talking about like the open questions. We're talking about, or the implications, like, well, what does this mean for human autonomy? Like, is our autonomy threatened by, our GPS systems telling us where to go? And those kinds of questions, once you start getting into the ethical dimensions too, I think all of those need to be part of the conversation. And honestly, the fun of having that like back and forth conversation is something that I think a lot of people don't realize does happen at the highest levels of inquiry, right? And so I kind of wanted to create a bridge where it's like, okay, you know, we can talk about all these things without jargon and invite people into the conversation.
So one of the things I find fascinating is so often we assume that people want certainty, that they want to know the answers to questions. But I constantly find that people just want to be part of the conversation. And they love it when there isn't certainty, but there are really interesting questions. And they see people grappling with those questions, and they can actually become part of that process themselves. That's certainly what seems to sort of pull in the audiences I work with. And it sounds like that is what you experience as well with Zombified and other platforms.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And then, you know, there's also just all of these amazing sort of scientific tidbits that, you know, once you start playing with them, it really opens up a lot of space for, you know, imagination. So like I did an episode with my colleague, Joe Alcock, and, you know, he and I worked a lot on like, is the microbiome manipulating us? Is it changing our eating behavior? Is it affecting our stress levels? You know, all of these kinds of things. And, you know, and once you start talking about, well, you know, the actual mechanisms that microbes use, not just to manipulate us, but to manipulate a wide variety of species, then all of a sudden, like, we're talking about real zombies, right? We're talking about like organisms who
So do you have to ever grapple with the risk of throwing your audience into existential crisis?
Oh, I do that all the time. It's just part of the deal. It's just part of the deal.
So Athena, that your emphasis on the creativity there toward the latter part of your comments also raises another kind of question, is that in this activity, and this is, you know, for you or for Andrew, in this activity, do you find through the discipline of communicating, trying to communicate useful knowledge, trying to engage people in the conversations that you're having, that you're taking new and different ideas into the rest of your work, into the work that's not in the podcast, into what you do as someone who studies cooperation, someone who studies zombies in real life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you have any domain in your life where you're being creative, it bleeds into everything else, you know, or when you're opening up your mind. Like I know, like when I've spent time learning new languages, the rest of my thinking is like much more flexible and creative. And I'm not the only person who's, you know, anecdotally reported this. And so, I mean, I definitely think that having that creativity be a part of my life, you know, feeds my work more broadly, encourages me to think about sort of, you know, all the different angles and levels that are involved when you have, you know, or because cooperation is kind of my, you know, my main academic field, cooperation, cheating, and, you know, the manipulation, zombification piece is kind of in there too. But I've been thinking, I think much more dynamically about a lot of the work I do on sort of what is cooperation, what is cheating, how does cheating manifest, because of this sort of creativity opportunity that I've had with the podcast and the YouTube channel.
So it's interesting you should say that. I find exactly the same. And for years, I've tried to use the discipline of writing creatively and doing creative things to help stimulate my own thinking. And it's amazing how effective it is. But the thing, I think, reflecting what you said, that always surprises me is that conversations with others just spark new ideas. And those others don't have to be academics. They can be anybody. And it's amazing, sort of, you take the whole swath of humanity, almost any conversation with people within society can spark new ideas if you're actually open to them. And actually, if you're serious about engaging with them and listening to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the kind of dangers often of like becoming an academic is that we get trained to use language that makes it harder for us to have a conversation with anybody who's interested, because we use jargon, we use, acronyms, we use like constructions that are so passive, you don't know what's doing the action.
So I've got to ask you then, your thoughts on jargon. Is there a place for jargon, or do we just need to strip it out of our lives?
So I think we probably would be fine if we stripped it out of our lives. And, because I mean, how many words do you save like with an acronym in a paper, versus if you just write it out?
It's just lazy. Let's admit it. It's just lazy.
Yeah. Although, there are some realms, right? Like when you get to like molecular biology, and
right, yes,
where
you, yes.
I mean, you need like sometimes you need a name for something.
So yes, if you had to spell out DNA every single time that you sort of said it, it would be a little bit difficult.
But even deoxyribonucleic acid is jargon, but we need that because it's a name for a specific thing. So I think we could actually probably do a lot better though with like the coming up with more common names or something for jargon that's hard to understand.
So I know Dave wants to come in, but yes,
I was just going to say, while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I was wondering if each of you could share what maybe even not what a typical podcast is like. What's an atypical podcast like? What is something that happened that jumped out of you, gave you a jump scare, surprised the hell out of you, or really intrigued you when you were in the midst of this conversation?
I'm not sure we have a typical podcast. So the Mission Interplanetary podcast actually follows a very specific structure. So we, Katie Coleman, former astronaut, and I just sort of start chatting about sort of what's going on, what's interesting us, and then we get to our guest and have the conversation. And then we have a segment at the end called Sounds of Space. Now, at the beginning and the end, this is intentionally serendipitous. So I have no idea what Katie is going to say. So this last week, she started talking about British baking shows of all things. At which point we sort of ended up with a conversation that somehow combined British baking shows and crocheting hyperbolic planes. So utterly unexpected, but utterly delightful and serendipitous. So yeah, that was interesting and fun. And then at the end of the show, when we had the Sounds of Space, one of us knows what the sound is, the other one has no idea whatsoever. So you've always got that element of surprise there, where you're trying to guess what on earth this thing is that you're listening to. So those two elements themselves, they challenge us as hosts to think on our feet, and it's incredibly stimulating to do that. But then, of course, that primes us for the conversation with the guests, where we're never quite sure where the conversation is going to go. So it's always delightful, always interesting, always unexpected. But to actually sort of hear those points of unexpectedness, you probably actually need to listen to the podcast, because you can suddenly hear when we're suddenly sort of going off on a different tack.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I mean, I think the sort of spontaneity and improvisation is absolutely essential, for me, both for the podcast and for Channel Zed, because, really, I mean, to me, that is the thing that is exciting about the science, about the scholarship, is like, you don't know what you're going to learn when you start talking to people who know things you don't know.
Yep.
And I try to keep that kind of that like wonder, that amazement at the things that are that are unknown as a real part of that. And then and in terms of like structure, it's interesting, Andrew, you talking about the sort of beginning and the end, where you're sort of chatting and it's more improvisational. My co-host Dave and I, we always have a little sort of intro and a little outro to the podcast, which we record after we've done the main conversation, the podcast. And that is always just kind of us like banter back and forth. Sometimes it's a little comedy, and that keeps it really fun, and keeps us in that, and everybody in that mindset of like the possibility. And similar with Channel Zed, but it's like even more open-ended, because the audience is commenting and asking questions, and we're responding to them. We have a few people on our production team who often are in the audience for Channel Zed, writing questions and comments, and sometimes doing like improv with us about the zombie apocalypse that's currently happening and how that's interfacing with the show that's happening, because the idea for Channel Zed is that it's television in the zombie apocalypse. So so we incorporate improv into the very structure of all of our shows on Channel Zed.
So Athena, as you do that, as an academic, how do you tread the line between feeling as if you have to be an authority and opening yourself up to asking questions? And I ask this because it's a weird world we live in, where we are expected to know stuff. We are expected to be the leading authority in an area. And that seems to be almost antithetical to putting ourselves in a position where we're asking the questions and we're being delighted by what we don't know. Does that push you out of your comfort zone, or is this something that you really embrace?
Yeah, well, I think maybe it's a question of, like not being the authority like on an area, like I'm not the authority on this discipline, right? But it's like, well, I know these things about this and these things about this, and I'm an authority on those things that I have that expertise on. But, there are so many other things where maybe I know a little bit, or maybe I know nothing. And, being comfortable sometimes saying, well, no, I know for sure it's this and this and this, or I'm pretty sure it's this and this and this. And then being like, well, I have no idea about that,
Right.
And just switching back and forth as needed based on the context.
Yeah. Yeah,
How about
and
you,
I ask because that to me is such an important bridge, it seems, to audiences, where you actually build empathy with them. They can see you as basically one of them. You're curious. There are things that you don't know. You're asking questions. You're delighted by what you learn.
Yeah. I mean, for me, so much of it is about like the fun of learning. So if someone is telling me something I don't know, whether it's in the podcast or, just chatting with somebody who I, meet at a coffee shop, like I want to learn stuff. Right. And I think all of us fundamentally do, but oftentimes we, get placed in educational contexts where that kind of, gets
Right.
like sucked out of us. And but I think that's there. I think it's, really fundamental to being human, that we want to understand our world. And, unfortunately, sometimes that gets channeled into weird beliefs about the world that are
What, like zombies, for instance?
We love stories though too, right? So that's a good thing. But
So imagine, folks, that there are some people in our audience who might be thinking, maybe I want to do a podcast. Could you take us back to the transition from the moment you thought about that, you had that thought, maybe I would want to do a podcast, to your first time with the microphone in front of your face? What happened? What kind of, what was that transition like? What kind of resources did you have to gather? Who did you have to persuade? What was that transition like for you?
Do you want to go first, Athena?
Yeah, sure. I could go first. Well, I was really lucky because within the psych department, we have a great group of folks who help with communication and media. And I talked with them about my idea, and they were like, sure, well, we'll help you record a few episodes and kind of get things off the ground. And actually, it was through recording the first 2 episodes that I found my co-host, who is the one of the managers of sort of, the marketing and public relations in the psych department. Because as I was talking with my my colleague, Clive Wynn, I did the first episode with him on the puppy apocalypse, how our relationship with dogs has zombified us. He was, popping in here and there with like interesting perspectives, and with the sort of very non-academic angle. And, I try to not be too academic. Like I try to really, approach things from a perspective of like, what does an average person know or not know? But Dave was even better at that. And I was like, do you want to be my co-host? And he was like, yeah, okay. So I got my co-host that way. And then, a couple episodes in, I decided that it made sense for me to buy some equipment and set things up so that I could just record in my office, like a little barrier and some microphones, and figured out how to upload everything to the servers and get everything. There's like some practical things that have to happen there, and also was very lucky to find a good sound producer, so I don't have to produce that myself, because that's a big time commitment, the sound production end. So so that was kind of my process. It was pretty organic, I think, but I also, I had support from my department to kind of initially get it off the ground. So yeah, Andrew, you probably had a slightly different experience because you're working with Slate and
yeah. So the current, yes, Mission Interplanetary has been quite different, but the first one that I did, Future Out Loud with Heather Ross, really was scrappy, and it just showed how easy it is to do this if you've got a great idea, and you can have great conversations. So this was Heather that drove this. She originally came up with the idea, and we thought, wouldn't this be fun to just talk to interesting people? And it was literally the two of us, a guest, her office, and a microphone. And you can actually tell if you go back and listen to those interviews, the sound quality is a little scrappy, but they're really interesting conversations. And that to me demonstrated that really you need both the imagination and the willingness to put time aside and the intentionality to do this. And it's actually surprisingly straightforward. There are the platforms out there where you can post this stuff. Of course, you can then kick it up to the next level. And so, for instance, on Zombified, the production values and production quality are fantastic. Everything from the way you put things together to the audio. And I think as you expand your audience, that makes a big difference. And of course, this is what happened with Slate. So with Slate, we have a fantastic producer and sound engineer. We've got Lance Gravi, who does the production, and Steve Christensen, who is fantastic on the sound, but it's a much bigger lift. I mean, that's why I've got this great big microphone here. Steve insisted that I had the same high-end microphone, which he's not getting back because I love. But it shows what a difference it makes when you actually have a team behind you. And this is one of the interesting things that fascinates me from an institutional perspective, because I mean, as an individual faculty, you can put this together really quickly. But when you think about the value to an institution, say your school or your college or ASU as a whole, if you really want a big audience, you need to start thinking about how you're going to invest in everything that goes into this, the producers, the equipment, the infrastructure, the marketing. And you can do an awful lot just with a small team, but I think you can do even more if you think about how you're going to scale up that impact within society.
So we've got a question from the audience that harks back to the jargon conversation. At what point, or how do you draw a line between getting your point looked at by your audience to be considered and thought about by using extremely technical terms versus making it appealing or attractive to the not so well-informed viewer?
So I have thoughts on this. I'm interested to see what Athena says. To me, good communication is good communication. And you need to strip away ideas of how you use language in certain ways. And the reason I say that is there's a temptation to use language to bolster yourself up, to demonstrate how much you know, and to really put yourself in a position of power. And academics are really good at this. We use language not to communicate, but to establish our superiority in an area. To me, though, communication is all about the audience. It's all about the person you're communicating with. So if you're not connecting with them, if you're not resonating with them, if you don't mean anything to them, if they don't understand what you're saying, it's absolutely pointless. And you can have conversations and communication with experts and non-experts alike using exactly the same language if you take that perspective. So jargon is important if you're in an environment where brevity of communication is critical and you're dealing with very, very specific topics where you need specific words. So for instance, if you're building a plane with somebody and you need to be very specific about what gizmo goes where, you've got to use the right words. But generally, if you're trying to talk about ideas and concepts and how those intersect with the world we live in, there are relatively few places where you need long, complex words and jargon unless you're trying to demonstrate how smart you are, which is not a good place to start with communication.
Andrew, what about hot button topics, science topics that really intersect, that really crash up with things that are going on in politics that are related to political divisions that we have?
Yeah, hot button topics in terms of should we engage, should we stay away, how on earth do you navigate them, all of the above, I guess.
Or even, to a certain extent, perhaps even how technical you might get in them, where, I think we're all familiar with examples in which the jargon might actually help, because it turns out when you get down to the conversation, we may be talking about two different things, or at two different times, or at multiple different places, and having a precise language might actually contribute a little bit.
I'm not sure. So clarity is critically important. You're exactly right. There's a real danger that if we're diffuse with our language, we can have very murky communication that either gives people the wrong idea or they think we're talking about something we're not. I think you can address a lot of that with the clarity with which we talk. And I don't think in many cases there's a necessity to bring jargon in or specific technical terms, unless the audience actually very clearly understands those. However, I would say that if you think about communication from the audience's perspective, you use the language that works to get your idea across. Sometimes that will require using long words or jargonistic type words, but the first point of departure should be, am I getting my ideas across successfully in a way that these people can actually use?
I absolutely agree. And I would add on to that, one of the, I think, most important things for the future of our planet is being able to have conversations that cut across disciplines with experts, across disciplines. And to the extent that experts only speak in their own jargon, they're not going to be able to talk to the other experts that are not in their discipline, which means it's going to be impossible to bridge that knowledge that we need to bridge if we're going to make progress on the toughest problems. So I think that, we actually have a sort of moral imperative to not use jargon, or to be able to communicate with people across disciplines, where we're not using that technical jargon, so that we can actually leverage human knowledge more effectively as we move into the future. And, conveniently, the same kinds of things that you would do to not use jargon for communicating with a general audience that's willing to do a little work to try to understand something, that's the same level that you should be aiming for communicating with experts in other disciplines who are interested. So that's kind of the sweet spot, I think, that we should be aiming for.
And I would oh, sorry.
I was going to say such an important point. I think we sometimes forget that the world of academia is so diverse these days that almost all conversations are with people that don't fully understand the depth of our own knowledge, which means that we've always got to be thinking about the language we use and how it's going to be understandable to other experts who aren't in our field.
And I think that connects wonderfully with what Athena was saying earlier in her comments about Zombified with respect to the sort of social and ethical dimensions of the science that she and her guests were communicating, because once you're in that register, there's a greater equality, if you will, in the conversation, that we like to think that people's values are more or less the same, of the same weight when they come into the door. Right. And then we can have the conversation around the values that people bring and see where we end up.
I agree. Yes. Yeah. And actually, so this is a slight diversion from podcast, but it's similar domain. Dave, as you know, one of the courses I teach is an undergraduate course, Moviegoer's Guide to the Future, where we'd sit around, watch movies. And the students come from very, very different very diverse backgrounds. The reason we do this is as soon as you're watching a movie, it's a communal experience. It's a great leveler. People can have conversations that transcend their own experience and tap into their own common values. And it's very, very similar to how you find those points of connection with any diverse audience. So you can have those broader conversations. And it works incredibly well.
It's the same with the zombie apocalypse. I mean, we're all, level ground in the zombie apocalypse. Like, It doesn't matter, what your position was in the before times. It's we're all on equal ground now. So
we're all trying to protect our brains.
Or share them.
Okay, can we get some more questions in the chats?
So while we're waiting for questions, actually, I have one for Athena. do you feel, okay, this is a very academic question. Do you feel as if your work here enhances you as an academic or creates barriers?
I mean, I think that it absolutely enhances my work as an academic. And I mean, it's kind of, I think allowed me to embrace a lot of the creative components of my approach that I think I've kind of kept a little bit more under the lid until now. And it's very, you know, I think it's very generative to be in this kind of position. And, you know, I think a lot though about, well, you know, now that I have tenure too, I think I feel a lot more comfortable with jumping
See,
in.
that was the undertone to that question.
Yeah. But you know, I started all of this before I had tenure, but I think you know, I feel much more comfortable with like, actually, this is part of my academic identity, as opposed to it's like a side thing,
Right.
you know, that I'm doing. And then I have all my, you know, serious work, and then I have my, you know, communication work. It's definitely, you know, becoming a filled in spectrum where, you know, there's a lot that I'm doing science communication that is also about kind of pushing these boundaries of thinking about like, how are we hijacked, and, you know, employing both knowledge frameworks from my academic approach and things that I've been learning from talking to people on the podcast and from, you know, thinking about the ethical dimensions and things like that.
So we've got a question from the chat. Have you guys given any thought to the use of podcasts in the classroom? What can instructors do that might enable or encourage students to embark on podcasting with their own work?
So funny you should say that. I've actually just posted something on the College of Global Futures Dean's blog from not an undergraduate, but a graduate student that produced a podcast as part of her PhD. So there are students that are using the format. I've had undergraduates that have used the format as well. But I think, like everything, the first question is, what are you trying to achieve in an educational program or in a class? And then what are the tools and mechanisms at your disposal? And in some cases, I think the whole idea of a podcast is really intriguing because it gives students the opportunity to explore ideas using a different medium, a different format that can be very powerful and very liberating. But I think it also has to be used in the right context.
Yeah, I would also add that, you know, I think there's an opportunity to really integrate podcasts into the classroom in terms of the educational component, because it opens up a lot of opportunity for people to have access who might not have the time to sit in a classroom for an hour and 15 minutes twice a week. But if they can, you know, pop in a podcast when they're doing their chores or commuting, you know, I think that there's an underexplored opportunity for it to, you know, be a foundation for new models for education.
Do you know anybody that's tried that? Because this fascinates me. I love the idea of, especially my online students, just being able to sort of put their headphones in and go off doing stuff and be learning at the same time.
Yeah, I'm actually planning fall 2022 to teach a course on the science of zombification that will have some of the lectures actually be, you know, listening to podcasts and engaging with sort of material that's, you know, like learning modules that are around that. And I'm hoping to make those broadly available too as sort of open educational resources. So it's kind of a thing that I'm going to be working on over the course of the next year to try to create some of that. The idea is to have it be a freshman level class that has no prerequisites, but then, you know, has sort of like a buffet of topics that are zombification related, you know, so. Yeah.
So another question in the chat, has the COVID pandemic changed podcasting? Because Athena, your work has sort of spanned pre-times and during pandemic times.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so I'll take this one because it has so much. Before the pandemic, every podcast did in person, and that was like my rule. Was like I'm not going to do it online because I like that back and forth. That, you know, you get to know someone, you chat with them a little before and after, and you have that organic conversation that you can only have in person. Well, when the pandemic happened, it was either don't record any more podcasts or figure out how to move it online. And so I did switch, and a number of podcasts in season 3 were recorded remotely. And I think it actually was fine. It's not quite as much fun as being in person with someone. But I tried to make sure to have a half hour like a week or two before to just chat and get to know the person. And I think that helped to have like a pre-meeting. The other thing that the pandemic changed, which is huge, is it's really what gave birth to Channel Zed, because we had a zombie apocalypse medicine meeting in 2018 in person. We had planned on doing one in 2020 in person, but because of the pandemic, we realized that's not going to happen. But we absolutely did not want to have an online meeting where people were giving Zoom presentations. Not that there's anything wrong with having online meetings with people giving Zoom presentations, but it just wasn't on brand for us, because we, wanted something interactive, something really playful, something really dynamic. And that's what led us to this idea of Channel Zed, where instead of, academic talks, it's a series of shows that have guests on them that are on different topics, and a really sort of playful format that also leveraged the platforms that people are already sort of being social on, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and really making sure that everyone could be kind of, having a fun social conversation while the talks were, or not even talks, but while the shows were going on. So yeah, it forced us to be really creative about how to hold the meeting. And we ended up basically for the 2 months before the meeting, having these shows once a week to kind of, test out, how's this going to work? Does this, is this something that we can actually, do for a 3.5 day conference? And we did. And then after that, we kept Channel Zed going because we were having so much fun with it. And so, so now we're actually just approaching the end of this season. We're going to take a break for summer and then come back in fall with Channel Zed. And it wouldn't be here if it weren't for the pandemic. And so, yeah.
I've got to say, the output that you're putting out there is phenomenal. I have no idea how you get so much out, but it's incredible.
Well, thanks. We have an amazing, creative, smart group of people, and it's really a team effort.
So one last question for me, unless anybody else has something that they want to add to the chat. You've talked about the audience in mostly general terms, as a general audience instead of non-experts, but that you want to engage with them in the same register that you would engage with other experts from different fields, because it's roughly the same kind of language that you'd want to use with both audiences. One of the things with technologies like these that mediate these conversations is they have different access, different impact on different age groups. Do you have that imagination for your audiences too? Are you thinking that you're addressing, Gen Zs or millennials, or, people who get stuck in traffic, or, how are you constructing your audiences for the work that you're doing beyond thinking about jargon?
Yeah. Such a good question. So with Mission Interplanetary, it's the audience, or the target audience, is space-interested people from round about middle school to high school, all the way up to however old you want to get. So it's less an age demographic and more a space interest and demographic that we're thinking very clearly about. But interestingly, in my other communication and engagement work, I'm always having to think about audiences, and especially Athena, you'll know this, anybody that's written a popular book or a trade book, you have to think very, very specifically in terms of your audience sector. And I almost always think in terms of early high school upwards, in terms of people that are curious and interested. I always think about them not in terms of their educational standing or ability, or even sort of level they've got to, but are they people that are asking questions? Are they people that want to know stuff? Are they curious?
Absolutely. I mean, I would have said the exact same thing. So it really is like, there people who are curious about their world, curious about our place in the world, curious about the things that affect us, the things that we affect in the world, about our future. That drive to understand things and to interact with people who know things that you don't know. That's really the heart of my podcast, both in terms of the conversational vibe that we have with the actual content that we're creating, and with sort of our aim in terms of the audience that we're trying to engage. And yeah, we're definitely like late high school and up, because like we also we swear and we're like edgy, and like that's not gonna really fly for like this 8-year-old audience. So yeah, we're late high school, I'd say, and above.
Thank you both for everything that you've contributed today, everything that you've contributed on the podcast, because they are a real opportunity, I think, to stretch ourselves to pursue the mission of a university that emphasizes things like access and the way that so many different kinds of people can participate both in the learning of knowledge and the creation of knowledge. And I really appreciate how you've communicated how your experiences here feed back into your own sense of creativity and your own sense of contribution. And really would love to encourage, and that's one of the reasons why we're having this series of engagement webinars, is really encourage people to think about stretching their own scholarship in these different kinds of directions. And I hope I can speak for you in saying that if you are interested in podcasting, either Andrew or Athena would be happy to hear from you and give you some tips beyond what they shared with you today. And with that, I'd like to again say thank you and turn it back to Lauren for a couple of announcements. Lauren.
I'm sorry, fell for the old yarn of the having the mute still on. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the wonderful discussion. It was one of the most interesting ones we've had all semester. And this has been Earth Month with a packed public engagement calendar, Earth Week, and on Thursday, Earth Day, actual Earth Day. And we're inviting you to attend our Earth Day celebration on Thursday, April 22nd at 4:30. Peter Schlosser, who's the Vice President and Vice Provost of Global Futures at ASU, is going to be leading a discussion with Greg Asner, who directs our Center for Global Discovery and Conservation Science at ASU. And Haunani Kane, who is Assistant Professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, will also be speaking at that event. So you can learn more at globalfutures.asu.edu. I put in the chat the links to that event and to our events calendar. Happy Earth Month, happy Earth Week, and happy Earth Day, everyone.